My name is Paige, I'm 32 years old, and the most important thing I ever did for my sister was mail her a baby gift she never asked for, from a party I was banned from attending containing a photograph I never actually looked at closely enough. 2 days after I mailed it, her husband was standing at my apartment door at 9 in the evening holding the album with both hands, not tucked under his arm, held against his chest the way you hold something when you are not sure if it is evidence or a confession. He looked at me and said, "How long have you known?" My first thought was an affair. I was wrong about that. What he told me in the next 40 minutes did not just collapse my sister's carefully built story. It collapsed the entire version of our family that everyone had been agreeing to maintain for years. And the thing that started all of it was a date my grandmother had written on the back of a photograph in 1991. A date I had glanced at and never thought twice about, because I had mailed that album out of kindness, nothing else. Just kindness toward a baby who had not yet been born and had not yet learned which version of the family they were going to be handed. I never knew it was loaded. Welcome back to Revenge Cold Stories. If you have ever done something out of pure love for people who stopped deserving it and watched that love land somewhere you never intended, stay with me. Subscribe before we go any further and drop your first name and your city in the comments. I want to know who is in this room tonight, and stay with me until the end because the twist in this story will leave you speechless. Now let me take you back. I work as a contract analyst for a healthcare logistics company in Charlotte. My job is reading documents that other people have signed without reading carefully and identifying where the language does not match the intent and where the intent does not match what actually happened. I have been doing it for 6 years. I am precise in the way that people become precise when imprecision has cost them something real. I built that career the way I built everything, without assistance and without the safety net of a family that was paying attention to whether I was okay. Community college while working retail, a state university on scholarships and loans, 3 years of entry-level work before anyone in my professional life took seriously that I was as good at this as I was. My family thought I was difficult. They had been thinking it since I was approximately 14 years old and had started pointing out things that were true, but that nobody wanted acknowledged. Not loudly, not dramatically, just with the specific bluntness of a person who has not yet learned that honesty in certain families is categorized as aggression. I had since learned it. I had simply decided the categorization was wrong. My sister's name is Vivian. She is 35 and has been the family's center of gravity since before she could have understood what that meant or chosen it. She is the kind of person who fills a room with warmth the moment she enters it, genuine warmth, which is the part I want to be honest about because this story requires honesty at every point, or it becomes something smaller than it is. Vivian was not performing. She was simply magnetic in the way that some people are magnetic, and she had been given enough love and enough protection and enough room to develop that magnetism without the friction that develops character through resistance. She had never been required to be wrong. This is the key to understanding everything that follows. Not that she was cruel, not that she was calculating in the way of someone sitting alone devising plans, but that she had spent 35 years in a family system where being wrong had consequences she had never personally experienced, and so she had developed no muscle for it. When Vivian made a mistake, the family absorbed it. When I made a mistake, the family discussed it. I had a full-body understanding of the difference by the time I was 16. My mother is Sandra, 59, the kind of woman whose primary orientation in any situation is how the situation will appear to the people who matter to her, and the people who matter to her are organized in a clear hierarchy that she has never stated directly and has never needed to. She loves her daughters. I do not doubt that, but love in Sandra's framework is expressed through protection. And protection is distributed according to perceived vulnerability, and Vivian had always been perceived as more vulnerable than me because I had never given the family any evidence that I needed protecting. I had needed it. I had just learned not to show that I did. Her line, the one she had been saying to me my entire life, was delivered so consistently that I had stopped hearing it as anything other than ambient sound. You always understand, Paige. 8 words. I had been processing them as a compliment for 20 years before I learned to hold them up to the light. You always understand meant you will not push back about this. It meant I do not have to carry the weight of your reaction. It meant you have trained yourself not to cost me anything, and I am going to keep walking through that door. Vivian's husband, Marcus, is 36. He had been in my sister's life for 2 years before the gender reveal, and I had met him 5 times in that period. He was quiet in the way of someone who has learned that quietness is the safest position in proximity to a person who fills every room they enter. He was steady. He fixed things. He did not announce himself. My grandmother had liked him. She told me so in one of our last phone calls before she died, 8 months before the gender reveal. She had said, "That one pays attention." She said it like it was the rarest quality she had encountered in years. She was not wrong. The gender reveal was on a Saturday in October. I found out I had not been invited on a Thursday evening when my mother called. She did not say hello. She said, "Vivian's doing the reveal at the Belmont on Saturday. She's asked that you not come." I was at my kitchen table going through a vendor contract with a highlighter. I set the highlighter down. I said, "Why?" My mother produced the pause she used when she was about to deliver something that required the listener to accept it without examination. The pause of someone who has already finished the conversation in her head and is now performing it for the record. She said, "She just wanted a peaceful day without any drama." The drama she was referencing was a conversation I had with Vivian 3 months earlier, in which I had told her, calmly and without raising my voice, that she had not acknowledged our grandmother's death with more than a 2-sentence text, and that it had hurt me. Vivian had ended the call. My mother had called me the next morning to tell me I had upset her. That was the drama. I had named something true in a family where naming true things was classified as creating problems. The naming had become the incident. The incident had been filed under Paige's ongoing difficulty, and now the difficulty was being used to explain why I should not be present at my sister's pregnancy announcement. I said, "Okay." My mother said, "You always understand." I said I would talk to her later and hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for a while. The vendor contract was still open in front of me. I looked at it without reading it. I thought about the Belmont, which was a venue I knew because I had been to a work event there 2 years earlier, expensive and elegant, and the kind of place that communicated the importance of an occasion through the quality of its surfaces. I thought about my grandmother. She had died 8 months earlier of a heart condition that had been developing for years, and that she had managed with the particular stoic competence of a woman who preferred to address problems practically rather than emotionally. She had left me the contents of her cedar box. Photographs, mostly. Documents. A letter she had written me when I was 20 that I had not been able to read all the way through without stopping for several months after she died. In the weeks since her death, I had been going through the cedar box slowly, a few photographs at a time, letting them surface the memories they contained without trying to organize or process everything at once. She had told me, in the last phone call we had before she went into the hospital for the final time, that she hoped the baby would know the family history. She had said someone should make sure of it. She had said it with the mild directness she used for things she considered obvious. I had been thinking about the memory book since that call. After I hung up with my mother on Thursday evening, I went to the closet and I got the cedar box. The memory book took 2 evenings to assemble. I want to be precise about what it was and what it was not, because the precision matters for everything that comes after. It was not a gesture toward Vivian. It was not a diplomatic offering or a way of inserting myself into an occasion I had been excluded from. It was not a message or a signal or anything other than what it appeared to be. It was a book for a baby who had not yet been born, a person who had not participated in any of the arrangements between the adults and their family, a person who deserved to have something real from the people who came before them, regardless of what those people had done to each other. I chose photographs for texture and period, the weight of family history across 4 generations, my grandmother's garden in summer, my grandfather at the lake before I was born, a photograph of my mother as a child that I had never seen before, small and serious in a dress that was too big for her, standing in front of a house I did not recognize. I found one of Vivian at what appeared to be a family gathering. She was standing with a man I did not recognize, close in the way that communicated familiarity rather than introduction. They were both laughing at something outside the frame. I turned it over. My grandmother had written the date on the back in her careful handwriting, the month and the year. I noted it the way I noted all the dates, as information that belonged to the document I was assembling, and I placed it in the sequence and moved on. I packaged the memory book on Friday evening, wrapped it carefully, wrote a card to the baby, not to Vivian, addressed it to the apartment, drove it to the post office before it opened Saturday morning and mailed it priority. Then I went home. I spent Saturday the way I spent any Saturday when I had no plans. I ran. I made a real lunch. I read for 2 hours in the afternoon. I watched the family group chat fill with photographs from the Belmont, gold balloons and flower arrangements, and the professional quality lighting of an event that had been designed to be photographed. I did not post anything. I looked at the photographs the way you look at a window from outside in winter, something warm and lit on the other side of glass. I was not angry. I was tired, in the way you are tired, after a very long time of being classified as the problem for the specific offense of being honest. I thought about my grandmother's voice on the phone. Someone should make sure of it. I had made sure of it. I had sent the gift, and I had let it go, and I had eaten a real lunch, and I had read for 2 hours. And that was the whole of Saturday. On Monday evening, there was a knock at my door. Soft, deliberate, the knock of someone who has thought about whether to knock and has decided that they have run out of other options. I opened it and found Marcus standing in the hallway with the memory book held against his chest with both hands. He looked like a man who had not slept since Saturday. He looked at me, and the first thing he said was the question that told me, before he explained anything else, that something had happened inside that album that I had not seen coming. He said, "How long have you known?" I looked at the album in his hands, I looked at his face, and I understood, in the way you understand things when your professional life has trained you to read the gap between what a document says and what the person holding it believes, that the date on the back of my grandmother's photograph had landed somewhere I had never intended to send it. I said, "Marcus, come inside and tell me what is happening." He came inside. And what he told me next reframed 2 years of my sister's story in a way that none of us, including me, had seen coming. Marcus sat on my couch with the memory book on the coffee table between us, and he did not touch it after he set it down. That detail mattered. He had carried it to my door with both hands and set it on the table, and then moved his hands away from it with the specific deliberateness of someone who needed physical distance from a thing that had been too close for too long. He looked at me and said, "The photograph, the one with Vivian and the man at the family gathering. Did you know who he was?" I said no. I assumed he was a cousin or a family friend, someone from my grandmother's side I had never met. He said, "His name is Daniel Rowe." The name meant nothing to me. He said, "Vivian dated him for 8 months before she met me." I waited. He said, "According to your grandmother's handwriting on the back of that photograph, that picture was taken in April of the year Vivian and I got together. She told me she had ended things with Daniel the previous September, 7 months before that photograph was taken." The contract analyst in me did the arithmetic before he finished the sentence. I said, "She was still seeing him when you met?" He said, "Based on that date, yes, for at least 4 months into what she told me was exclusively our relationship." The room was quiet for a moment in the specific way rooms go quiet when information has arrived that requires reorganization of several prior understandings simultaneously. I said, "Marcus, start from the beginning. Tell me what happened." He exhaled. He started from the beginning. He had noticed the first inconsistency in July, not with suspicion, with the mild confusion of someone who trusts their partner and assumes that confusion about timelines is the kind of thing that has a reasonable explanation. Vivian had mentioned in passing during a conversation about baby names a story about a trip she had taken to Savannah. She had placed the trip in a specific month during what she described as her single year, the year before she met Marcus. Marcus had a photograph from that trip. He had seen it early in their relationship on her phone, when they were doing the thing people do in new relationships where they scroll through each other's lives looking for points of connection. The photograph was dated 4 months after she said she had been single. He had asked about it casually. She had said he was misremembering. He had let it go because that was the kind of man he was. He trusted people until the evidence made trust unreasonable. The second inconsistency arrived in August. He had been filling out medical forms for the pregnancy, the kind that required a conception date for gestational age calculations. The date the midwife gave him did not match the timeline he had in his head. He had asked Vivian about it. She had said the midwife was working from an approximation and not to overthink it. He had not overthought it, but he had not forgotten it either. He filed it the way he filed things that did not add up, quietly, in the background, with the low-level alertness of a man whose instincts were telling him something his conscious mind had not yet finished examining. The third inconsistency was the one that made him order the test. He had found a message on her phone in September, not from looking, from a notification that appeared when she left her phone on the kitchen counter and walked out of the room. A name he did not recognize, a message that was 3 words. I heard. Congratulations. He had not said anything to her. He had ordered the DNA test kit 2 days later. He said, I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was constructing a story from 3 details that probably had 3 separate explanations, but I could not unknow the Savannah date, and I could not unknow the conception date, and I could not unknow that message. He said, the results came back 4 days ago. He stopped. He looked at the table. He said, the baby is not mine biologically. I sat across from him on a Monday evening in October, and I held that information the way you hold something that has changed shape unexpectedly. Still the same weight, but a different form entirely. I said, I am sorry. He said, I did not know what to do with it. I did not know what any of it meant or what I was going to do about it. And then your album arrived on Sunday morning, and I opened it because Vivian was still asleep, and I thought it would be photographs of your grandmother's things, and instead there was that photograph. He said, I knew his face. I had seen it once 2 years ago in an old photograph of Vivian's that she had shown me early on and said was someone she used to know. She had not said his name. I had not asked. He said, I turned the photograph over and read the date, and the date was April. He said, and I understood then that the story I had been told about my own relationship had not been the story that actually happened. I said, you came here because you thought I knew. He said, you had put the photograph in the album. I thought you had put it there intentionally. I thought you had been sitting on this information and had finally decided to send it in a way that could not be traced back to a direct accusation. I said, Marcus, I did not know who was in that photograph. I did not know his name. I did not know your timeline. I did not read the date on the back as anything other than a date. I assembled that album for the baby, not for Vivian, not against Vivian, for a person who had not been born yet and deserved to have something real from the family they were coming into. He looked at me. He said, you genuinely did not know. I said, I genuinely did not know. He sat back on my couch. He pressed both hands against his face. He said into his hands, of course you didn't. He said it the way people say things when they have been carrying a theory that was the only explanation available to them and have just discovered the actual explanation, and the actual explanation is both simpler and more devastating than the theory. I said, what are you going to do? He lowered his hands. He said, I do not know yet. I have been holding this since Thursday, and the only person I have spoken to about it is you, and I did not even come here to speak to you. I came here because I needed to understand whether you had done this deliberately, and I needed to look at your face when I asked. He said, you did not? I said, no. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, she's going to say you did it on purpose. And I said, I know. He said, when this comes out, and it is going to come out, she is going to say you deliberately put that photograph in the album to expose her. She is going to say you knew, and you wanted to destroy everything, and you used the baby as the instrument to do it. I said, she is going to say that because it is the only version of the story that does not require her to be responsible for what happened. He looked at me. I said, I have been the family's explanation for things that needed explaining my entire life. Whatever she did, I will be the reason it came out. That is how this family works. He did not disagree. He picked up the memory book. He looked at it for a moment. He set it back down. He said, Your grandmother wrote those dates on everything. I said, She was precise. She thought documentation was how the past survived. He said she was right. He stood up. He said, I am going home. I do not know what I'm going to say to her tonight. I do not know what comes next. I just needed to understand whether you had meant to do this. I said, I did not. He said, I know that now. He picked up the memory book again. I said, Take it. It belongs to you as much as anyone. He looked at the album in his hands. He nodded once. He left. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after the door closed. The cereal I had been eating before the knock was still in the bowl on the counter, long past salvageable. I did not replace it. I sat with a glass of water and I thought about what had just been deposited in my apartment and what it meant and what was going to happen next. The contract analyst part of my brain had already begun organizing what I knew. Marcus had a DNA test. Results confirmed. He had timeline inconsistencies going back months that he had documented through the specific memory of someone who files things rather than discards them. He had a name, Daniel Rowe. He had a photograph with a date on the back in my grandmother's handwriting that placed Vivian with Daniel in April of the year she claimed to have been exclusively with Marcus. He had a case. He had not asked me to help him build it. He had not asked me for anything. He had come to understand whether I was an adversary, and had discovered I was not, and had left with his album and his test results and his name and his very specific memory of a Savannah photograph and a conception date, and a 3-word message from someone whose name he did not recognize. He had everything he needed. He did not need me. What I was about to need was a plan for what happened when Vivian found out he had come here, because he had been right about one thing with absolute certainty. She was going to say I did it on purpose. The call came the next morning at 7:42, not from Vivian, from my mother. Sandra called before 8 when she needed to address something before the day's social architecture could complicate her approach. 7:42 meant she had been awake for a while and had decided this required immediate management. She did not say good morning. She said, What did you put in that album? I said, Old photographs from Grandma's cedar box, the ones she kept for 60 years. My mother said, Vivian says you did this deliberately. I said, I know she does. A pause that had the quality of someone who had expected a denial and received a different response. She said, Did you? I said, I assembled a memory book for my future niece or nephew using photographs my grandmother left me. I mailed it because I wanted the baby to have something real from the family. I did not know there was anything unusual about any photograph I included. She said, Vivian says there was a photograph that caused problems. I said, There was a photograph with a date on the back that my grandmother had written in her handwriting. I did not notice anything significant about the date. I was assembling the album for the baby. I was selecting photographs for what they showed, not for what was written on the backs. My mother said, But you did include it. I said, I included it because it was a photograph of Vivian at a family gathering, and it belonged in a family memory book. My mother said, Vivian is devastated. I said, Nothing. She said, Marcus has left the house. I said, I am sorry to hear that. She said, She says you have been waiting to do something like this, that you have always resented how close she is to the family. The familiar shape of it, the mechanism that had been running my entire life. Something had happened that needed an explanation that did not implicate Vivian, and I was the available explanation. I said, Mom, I was excluded from her gender reveal party. I mailed a gift for the baby anyway because I wanted the baby to have something from our grandmother. That is the whole of what I did. Whatever Marcus discovered from that photograph is between Marcus and Vivian. My mother said, You must have known. I said, I did not know. She said, How could you not know? I said, Because I was assembling a memory book, not conducting an investigation. I was doing something kind for a child who had not been born yet, for people who had just told me I was too much drama to be included in their celebration. The last sentence landed in a silence that had a different quality than the ones that had preceded it. My mother said carefully, "You always understand, Paige." I said, "I understand completely." I said, "I understand that whatever Vivian did is not my fault. I understand that whatever Marcus discovered is not something I engineered. And I understand that the version of the story where I am the villain is the only version that protects Vivian from being responsible for her own choices." Another silence, then quietly, "She's my daughter." I said, "I know. So am I." I let that sit. Then I said, "I am going to work now. I will talk to you when you are ready to have an honest conversation." I ended the call. I sat for a moment with my phone on the table. Then I opened my laptop and pulled up the vendor contract I had left half highlighted on Thursday evening, and I went back to the work that required me to be precise about dates and language and the difference between what a document said and what had actually happened. I was very good at that work. I had been practicing it my entire life. The family group chat detonated at 11 that morning. I know the time because I was in a meeting and my phone vibrated 4 times in quick succession, which was the pattern that indicated the family group chat had activated in the specific way it activated when something had breached the surface of the image my mother maintained. I checked it after the meeting. 43 messages. I scrolled through them with the focused attention of a person reading a document for the gap between the stated position and the actual one. The pattern was consistent. Vivian was hurting. The situation was Paige's fault. Someone needed to reach out to Paige and explain the damage she had caused. Several relatives who had not spoken to me in months had developed urgent opinions about my behavior. My cousin Dana, who had been at the gender reveal and had not thought to text me on the day, had written 3 separate messages about the importance of family loyalty. I noted the irony without commenting on it. At the bottom of the thread, posted 9 minutes before I read it, was a message from my Aunt Carol, who was 71 and had known my grandmother for 60 years, and had the particular clarity of someone who had watched a family long enough to see its actual patterns rather than its stated ones. She wrote 4 words, "Leave Paige out of this." Then she left the group chat. I put my phone in my pocket. I went back to work. The photograph was already out in the world doing what my grandmother's careful handwriting had always done, documenting what had actually happened. I had not put it there as a weapon, but the truth, once it is written down in someone's careful handwriting and placed in a cedar box and handed to the right person at the right time, does not ask permission before it becomes visible. It simply surfaces, the way it always does, eventually. The weeks that followed had the quality of a controlled demolition, not explosive, not the kind of collapse that arrives all at once with noise and visible debris, the kind that happens from the inside, where the structural supports give way in sequence and the building stands slightly longer than it should before the shape of it changes permanently. I watched it from a distance because distance was the only position available to me, and also, I had come to understand, the only honest one. Marcus had moved out of the apartment he shared with Vivian the morning after he came to my door. He had gone to his brother's place in Raleigh. I knew this not because he told me, but because my Aunt Carol called me 4 days after the group chat implosion and told me what she had been able to piece together from the family's various communications, which she had been reading with the sharp attention of someone who had decided to be the family's honest witness, even if no one had asked her to take on the role. Carol was 71 and had been my grandmother's closest friend for 40 years before my grandmother died. She had the directness of someone who had watched families construct elaborate fictions about themselves for decades and had run out of patience for the construction. She said, "Your sister is telling everyone you planted that photograph intentionally." I said, "I know." She said, "Your mother believes her." I said, "I know that too." She said, "I don't." I said, "I know." She said, "Your grandmother wrote dates on the back of every photograph she ever kept. She did it from 1962 until the year she died. It was how she remembered things. It was how she thought the past should be maintained." A pause. She was not building a case, she was just being who she always was. I said, "That is exactly right." Carol said, The photograph landed where it landed because you assembled that album with love and mailed it to people who had excluded you from a celebration, and whatever Marcus discovered from it is between Marcus and your sister." I said, "That is the whole of it." She said, "I wanted you to know someone in this family understands that." She said it simply, without performance, the way people say things when they mean them precisely and do not need the other person to respond with anything other than acknowledgement. I said, "Thank you, Carol." She said, "Your grandmother would be furious about all of this." I said, "I know she would." She said, "She would also be proud of you." I held that for a moment. Then I thanked her again, and we said goodbye, and I went back to the vendor contract that had been waiting on my screen since the morning Marcus knocked on my door. Vivian called me on a Thursday, 11 days after the gender reveal, 9 days after Marcus came to my apartment, 2 days after the family group chat had quieted from a detonation into something more like sustained background noise. She called at 2 in the afternoon, which was the time she called when she wanted to catch me at work, because catching me at work meant I would be in a professional context, and the professional context would, in her experience, make me more measured than I might otherwise be. She was not wrong about that. I answered. She said, "I need you to tell me the truth." I said, "About what?" She said, "About the photograph, about why you put it in the album." I said, "I put it in the album because it was a photograph of you at a family gathering and it belonged in a family memory book." She said, "You knew what it would do." I said, "I did not know who was in the photograph. I did not know his name. I did not know your timeline. I did not read the date on the back as anything significant. I was selecting photographs for what they showed, not for what was written on them." She said, "That is very convenient." I said, "It is the truth." She said, "Why would you include a photo of a man you didn't even recognize?" I said, "Because our grandmother kept it, because it was a photograph from a family gathering, because the baby deserves to know the full texture of the family they are coming into, not just the curated version." A silence, then she said, "You ruined my life." I said, "Vivian, I mailed a baby gift to a party I was banned from attending because you told our mother you did not want drama. Whatever Marcus found in that album, he found because of choices you made, not because of anything I did." She said, "You could have taken the photograph out." I said, "I did not know there was anything in the photograph that needed removing." She said, "I don't believe you." I said, "I know." She said, "You have always resented me." I had been expecting that sentence since Marcus left my apartment. It was the sentence the story required to have someone say because the story needed me to be the reason for it. I said, "I have never resented you. I have been hurt by you on specific occasions, and I have named those occasions honestly when they occurred. That is not resentment. That is just being honest in a family that treats honesty as drama." She said, "You're doing it again." I said, "I know it feels that way to you." She said, "Marcus is gone." Her voice changed when she said it. The scripted quality left and something raw arrived. Not performance, just a woman who was 35 years old and pregnant and alone in an apartment that had recently had another person in it and now did not. I said, "I am sorry about that. I mean it." She was quiet. I said, "I did not do this to you, but I understand that you need to believe I did because the alternative is something you are not ready to look at yet." She said nothing. I said, "When you are ready to have a different conversation, I am here." She hung up. I sat at my desk for a moment, then I went back to work. The family's management of the situation followed the pattern I had expected. My mother attempted to hold the narrative together through the mechanism she had always used, which was the careful distribution of partial information to different family members in ways that produced sympathy for Vivian and positioned my involvement as the inciting incident rather than the accidental catalyst. This worked with most people. It did not work with everyone. My cousin Dana, who had posted 3 times about family loyalty in the group chat, called me 2 weeks after the implosion. I had been bracing for the call to go the way of the group chat messages. Instead, Dana said something I had not expected. She said, "I have been thinking about this for 2 weeks and I need to ask you something directly." I said, "Ask." She said, "Did you know what was in that photograph?" I said, "No." She said, "I believe you." A pause. She said, I have been thinking about the things I have watched in this family for the last 10 years, and the way Vivian gets explained, and the way you get explained, and I think I have been explaining them the wrong way. I said nothing. She said, "I'm sorry for what I posted in the group chat." I said, "I appreciate that." She said, "Is Marcus okay?" I said, "I do not know. We have not been in contact since he came to my apartment." She said, "He seems like a good man." I said, "He is." She said, "I hope he is okay." I said, "Me too." Marcus sent me a text message 6 weeks after the knock on my door. 3 sentences. He said he wanted me to know he was not going to tell anyone I had confirmed anything to him that night. He said he understood I had not known what was in the photograph and he was sorry for assuming I had. He said he hoped I was well. I wrote back 2 sentences. I said thank you for coming to talk to me rather than assuming from a distance. I said I hoped he was finding his footing. He did not write back and I did not expect him to. We were not friends. We were 2 people who had been in the same room on an evening when something that could not be unknown had arrived, and we had sat with it together and then gone our separate ways with whatever it had given us. What it had given me was confirmation of something I had been carrying for a long time without a name for it. The family's arrangement had always depended on me absorbing the cost of Vivian's protection, not because anyone had decided this explicitly, because it was the path of least resistance, and I had been the path of least resistance for so long that the arrangement had become invisible to everyone, including me. What I had sent into the middle of that arrangement was a memory book assembled from love and my grandmother's careful handwriting. The arrangement had broken because of something my grandmother had written in 1991, not because of anything I had done, not because of any intention I had carried, just because my grandmother had understood that the past needed to be documented honestly and had spent 60 years doing exactly that. The baby was born in April, a girl. My mother called me to tell me, and I sat with the information for a moment and felt something uncomplicated about it, which was relief that the baby had arrived and was healthy and was in the world. I said, "That is wonderful." My mother said, "Vivian is doing well." I said, "I am glad." My mother said, "Marcus was there." I said nothing. She said, "They are trying to work through things." I said, "I hope they can." My mother said, "It will take time." I said, "Most things do." She said, "Paige." I said, "Yes." She said, "I know I said you always understand." I said, "You have said it many times." She said, "I think I used it the wrong way." The sentence arrived in a form I had not heard from my mother before, not an apology exactly, the precursor to one, the sentence that acknowledges a pattern without fully naming it yet, the beginning of a conversation that was going to take longer than one phone call to complete. I said, "I know you did." She said, I am trying to understand what happened." I said, "What part?" She said, "All of it, the photograph, Marcus, what Vivian told us about her timeline, what was actually true." A pause. I have been doing a lot of thinking about the difference between protecting someone and covering for them. I said, "Those are very different things." She said, "I am starting to understand that." I said, "That is a hard thing to arrive at when you love someone." She said, "Yes." She said, "I want to have an honest conversation with you, not today, when I am ready." I said, "I will be here." She said, "You always are." She said it differently than she had always said it before, not as a tool, as an observation, the specific recognition of someone who is beginning to see what they have been taking for granted. I said, "Yes, I always am." I found the duplicate photograph 3 weeks after the baby was born. I had kept a copy of every photograph I had included in the memory book, printed on plain paper, organized in a folder, a habit from my professional life. You keep records of what you send before you send it. I opened the folder to look for a different photograph, one of my grandmother at the lake that I wanted to frame for my apartment, and I found the duplicate of the photograph with Vivian and Daniel Rowe standing close at the family gathering. I turned it over. My grandmother's date on the back. April of that year. I looked at the date for a long time. I thought about my grandmother sitting at her kitchen table with a felt-tip pen, writing the month and year on the back of every photograph she kept. I thought about 60 years of careful documentation. I thought about what she had said in our last phone call about the baby knowing the family history. She had not known what she was saying. Or possibly she had known everything and had trusted me to assemble it honestly, and had known that honesty, eventually, finds its way to the surface regardless of who is managing the narrative above it. I would never know which. What I knew was that she had written the date because she always wrote the date, because she believed the past deserved to be maintained accurately, because she had understood something that the rest of the family had not, which was that the truth does not require engineering. It just requires someone to write it down and trust that the right person will eventually hold the paper. I put the duplicate photograph back in the folder. I went to make coffee. Sometimes the person called dramatic is simply the one who refuses to ignore the truth. I didn't set out to expose anyone. I just sent a baby gift, and the truth found its own way into the light. Hold on to the photos, save the memories. Honest records have a way of mattering when you least expect it. Tell me your name and city in the comments, and let me know if you've ever been blamed for telling the truth. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.